All right, we are going to wrap up our discussion of Leviticus and Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Like I said the other day, we're not really going to be touching on Numbers, unfortunately, and kind of going to unfortunately have to give Deuteronomy short shrift. But we can talk about we can kind of wrap up all three books with a nice little bow here today. And the way I want to do that is by kind of connecting what we talked about on Wednesday, with what we'll be saying today. So on Wednesday, we talked about the holiness code, right? What it meant to be holy for ancient Israel. Right? We talked about that idea of being set apart. Okay. We talked about all the laws that we see in Leviticus and even in Exodus being kind of connected to that, right? All of these laws somehow setting Israel apart for proper worship of Yahweh and for being the kind of community that can properly worship Yahweh, right? But the set-apartness of Israel was not just through observation of the laws, but it was also through the observation of rituals. And so that's where we want to kind of move today, is talking about the rituals of ancient Israel as we see them in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And in particularly through the offerings. Okay. Because if you noticed when you were doing some of your reading in Leviticus and possibly in doing your reading in the textbook, that there's a lot of talk about offerings, right? A lot of talk about rituals. It's like, okay, here's what it means to be unclean if you have this kind of skin disease or this kind of, bleeding or whatever, right? But then in order to be clean, or once you are clean, you have to go through certain rituals, in which case there are lots of offerings. Typically, take these doves, take this ram, take this lamb, right? All these different kinds of offerings. So we're going to look at how these work in ancient Israel, or what they mean. Now, there's lots of different types of offerings that that Leviticus goes through, and we're not going to really dig into all the different types. There's burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, sacrifice of well-being, and sin and guilt offerings. What I want to really look at, more so than each type, are the functions. Okay, we're going to see three main functions of the offerings. Okay. Does anybody have any guesses about what the functions of offerings may be, how they work? Why offerings were important in ancient Israel?
I guess just sacrificing something. Sacrifice to show respect. Something that you hold dear to sacrifice.
Okay, so sacrificing something. And we kind of have this, sometimes we can have this overblown idea of sacrifice. Just think about like the basic idea of sacrificing something is giving up something of your own, right? And the kind of spiritual import that could be seen in that. Like, I'm giving up this thing that is mine for this greater thing, for this spiritual purpose, right? I'm sacrificing, making a sacrifice.
Like a blessing.
Good.
Like in church, they say you give 10% or whatever you can give.
Mm-hmm.
God will bless you or whatever.
Okay, so the idea that if you make this sacrifice, if you make this offering, then you will be blessed. Right, good. What else?
Could it be like that as like forgiveness for something?
Forgiveness, definitely. The idea of the sin and guilt offering is for forgiveness. Good.
Isn't it a way to show your loyalty?
Yeah, you could say that.
Like to God, if you make an offering to God, this is my loyalty to you. I'm offering something that's I see as precious, as precious.
Sure. Yeah.
Do the offerings that they had represent the blood covenant? Does it have anything to do with that?
I don't think so. And the only reason I'm going to say no to that is because because the covenant is already made, the promise is made.
Oh, okay.
And I don't think that the Hebrew people saw their offerings operating in that same kind of way.
Okay.
but that's good. So the one function that a lot of you kind of got to was, in essence, personal expression. Right? And primarily, a lot of the offerings center around gratitude. Right? This idea that Yahweh has given you something, and so in giving back, you are expressing gratitude. Right? You're saying, look, everything I have, I see it as coming from this divine creator and owner of the world, and so I'm going to give back. Right? Because this is, in a sense, rightfully Yahweh's. So there's that kind of personal expression of gratitude. We're going to come back to this one, but I want to go ahead and throw it up here. It's this idea of restoring order. Okay, and we'll come back to this one and talk a little bit more about what it means to restore order. But the third one I want to get to and kind of dig into first is a form of taxation. And Joan brought that up. The idea of a tithe is even connected with this. Okay. The three primary festivals in ancient Israel where you would have a lot of offerings took place around harvest times. Right? And so you have this harvest, right? So you can have this expression of gratitude, saying, God, thank you for this harvest, thank you for this bounty, so on and so forth. And then there are these offerings that are prescribed in the text. In order for the kind of first fruits to be collected and stored in the temple. And this can be used for people in need. This can be used in times of drought. But it is a way for the temple to kind of have this store of supplies in case they are needed. Right? And when we think about the ancient world, a lot of the ancient world was centered around places of worship and temple life. And so it makes sense that it's the temple doing this and not any kind of formal government in a sense. Right? Even though we see this, for example, in Egypt with, like in our names, with Joseph, right? With Joseph saying there's going to be a famine, you need to collect food, right? We see that same kind of thing happening, right? This need to collect food. Because in the ancient world, you don't have such reliable farming techniques, right? And so offerings can kind of function as a form of taxation. And tithing kind of plays into that. Now, let's go back to the one restoring order. Any ideas on how offerings can help restore order? What would that mean, to restore order?
It felt like to get things back in right standing.
Okay.
Oh, is that?
Yeah.
Would that be what we were talking about on Wednesday, as far as being clean and unclean?
Mm-hmm.
And, if someone has sinned and they sacrifice something, then they are actually going from the state of being unclean to the state of clean.
Yeah.
Which is restoring.
Yeah. So in a sense, we are restoring, and we're just going to call it set apartness. Let me put another little line there. Right. We have this idea of clean and unclean, holy and unholy, or holy and common. And when there is sin, or when there is something that is broken within how the community is functioning, or when somebody is sick, right? They're kind of falling outside of that clean category, falling outside of that holy category, and need to be brought back into that, need to restore the order. And this makes a lot of sense if we think back even to Genesis, right? The idea that God is a God of order, moving from chaos to order. And one way that offerings function is that when something starts getting off kilter in the community, whether that's through conflict or illness, order needs to be restored. So that, right? Health needs to be restored. Proper community needs to be restored. Because it's only when you have that proper community functioning well that Israel can be a people who worships Yahweh correctly. Right? Yeah.
So you're saying that through offerings, it restores order among the people of Israel?
Right. But also, not just order among the people of Israel, but in a sense, cosmic order. Right? Because the two are connected. Right? Think back to the Decalogue, the idea of worshiping Yahweh and being the people who worship Yahweh. Both those ideas are connected. And so even the idea of if there's conflict within the people of Israel, then that kind of represents this cosmic chaos as well. Yeah. Good way of looking at this is through the day, or it's actually, I can't say the day of Yom Kippur, because Yom just means day, but it's through Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. Okay. There are, of course, as with many of these offerings, lots of details here that we could go into, but I want to focus on the way that this Day of Atonement works, right? One thing that's kind of important to note quick, I know sometimes atonement gets described as like at one minute. This is not really what the word Kippur means. Is like, it doesn't necessarily mean becoming one with somebody else. Atonement in Hebrew is closer to the idea of covering. Okay. You have the same word or variations of this word being used to describe pitch that covered the ark. That covered Noah's Ark, for example. And this is also can be used in a sense of a bribe. Right? Think of like I'm covering my eyes, I'm looking away, I'm not seeing what's really happening. Oh, you want to come in? Oh, just hand me some money and I'll look away. I'll cover my eyes and not see what's going on. So this idea of Yom Kippur is in a sense covering over Israel's sins, right? Making it so that God is not going to look at Israel and equate it with its sins, right? Not in the sense so much of bribing God, but this idea of covering over. Okay. So this is, sorry, what?
I'm sorry, like hiding?
Like hiding? In a sense, yeah. I mean, you are, in a sense, like making restitution in some kind of way. You get biblical examples of like a Kippur being offered for having killed somebody, right? Or the king, there's a passage where I think it's the king of Egypt and not Abimelech. One of the kings that Abraham sells his sister or his wife off to as a sister, when that king is trying to make right with Abraham, he gives Sarah back to Abraham and says, like, I'm giving you all of this as a covering for what I've done, so that God won't punish me. Okay? And the way that this covering works in the Day of Atonement is you get 2 goats. One goat is sacrificed to Yahweh. And what's interesting, and this is kind of like where we see hints of a polytheistic or a henotheistic past, is it says that the other goat is sent into the wilderness for Azazel. No idea. There's no other parts in Scripture about this. But in a sense, kind of like this desert deity, this desert demon, something like this, that this goat is being sent away to. But what this goat isn't just randomly walking out into the wilderness just for the hell of it. This goat the priest has put all the sins of Israel, all the sins of the priesthood, all the sins of the temple onto this goat and sent it away into the desert. And this is where we get the phrase scapegoat. Exactly.
Oh, God.
Bless you.
Crazy.
I didn't know if that was just like surprise and excitement at scapegoat or... Yeah. This is where the idea of scapegoat comes from. It's the idea of literally, in the Day of Atonement, in Yom Kippur, all the sins of the people and all the sins of the priesthood being sent away into the wilderness to carry those sins away. And in a sense then, restoring order, right? You see how if we take all the sins and in a sense we put them onto this goat and send it out into the desert, out beyond the camp of Israel, right? It's in a sense restoring the order that was here, right? And this is one way that offerings work, a way that helps us understand what's really going on when we read all these prescriptions about offerings.
I wonder what they did if that goat came back.
I don't know.
You know,
Well, there was, my guess is, I mean, there's somebody who was responsible for taking this goat out. So I'm guessing he might get in a little bit of trouble. Or they might just say, no, it's definitely not that goat. It's definitely not the same goat. So, anyways, if you want to look this up on your own, this is Leviticus, I think it's 16:20 through 22. Make sure I've got that, yeah. Yeah, 16.
Yeah.
And Leviticus 16 is all about the Day of Atonement. 20 through 22 is kind of talking about this idea of the scapegoat. Give you some reference points there. Okay, now the last two things I kind of want to talk about.
You sure you don't want to move away from it?
The last two things I want to talk about are the Holiness Code and the Deuteronomic Code. Okay. The code that we've looked at before, if you remember, was the covenant code. And this is what followed the Decalogue, right? We had the Decalogue, and then all the laws that kind of followed that were the covenant code. Okay. But now, moving into the holiness and the Deuteronomic code, the holiness code is found in Leviticus 17 through 26. And whereas with the covenant code, which kind of outlined for a very real community what it meant like to be a proper community that can properly worship Yahweh, with the holiness code, we get a little bit more of a utopian ideal, right? This is more of an idealistic presentation of what that community should look like.
It is part of the test.
It's all part of the test.
I thought we was
Right.
gonna go over it.
And so what we have in this holiness code is not just protecting justice, but pursuing justice. Okay? Remember that covenant code, it's like, if somebody does this, here's what you do, right? It's very kind of like these apodictic and causistic laws, pretty much laying out, here's how you protect justice. Holiness code is pursuing justice. And along with that, holiness, right? Because these ideas are, the holiness code kind of links these ideas of justice and holiness.
To be holy.
Yeah, right. Because to be the covenant people, to be a holy people, they have to pursue justice, right? They have to seek that out. Okay. And so what we have here is the idea of not just protecting the neighbor. This is a good example of not just protecting but pursuing justice. The idea that we are not just supposed to protect the neighbor, we are to love the neighbor. Right? So the whole idea of loving thy neighbor is kind of rooted in this holiness code.
So that's not in the Deuteronomy code.
No, we're just up here with the holiness code.
That was a part of that video you put up, right? On Moodle?
Yeah, exactly. What that passage that he references, that comes from the holiness code. Exactly. Okay.
What you got? Love thy neighbor, or love
Thy. Love thy neighbor. Just a way that a lot of people have heard that, love thy neighbor. You could just say love your neighbor. It's fine. It's the same thing. Right? And finally, what we have here with the holiness code, remember this idea of, because we're combining this idea of holiness and justice, we're also combining that idea of justice with worship. With the holiness code, there is a strong emphasis on worship. A proper community is a community that is focused around worship.
Proper community.
That is focused around worship, right. So it's not just about holy days, right? It's about day in and day out worship, right? So it talks about festivals, it talks about holy days, it talks about the sabbatical years, it talks about the year of Jubilee, this year where if you had to sell your land because you were in so much debt and go work for somebody, this year of Jubilee, all that debt's erased and you get your land back, right? And it's debated whether that actually ever happened or whether that was just kind of this idealistic kind of utopian vision of what it should be. So there's a lot of debate around whether that the Jubilee year was actually ever practiced in ancient Israel. Because it is so, you can imagine how disruptive that would be to say like a nation's economy. You know, it's just like there's all this debt and boom, it's erased. And everybody's going back and reclaiming land, all this kind of thing. So, okay. Finally, the Deuteronomic Code. Any guesses where the Deuteronomic Code's found? You guys are brilliant. I knew I was getting through. Deuteronomy 12 through 26. Okay. This one also, like the Holiness Code, is much more idealistic. You could even say utopian. Okay. What we also see with the Deuteronomic Code is less of an emphasis on worship. In a sense, we could just say it's more humanitarian. Right? There's still this concern for justice, but it's less couched in this idea of holiness and worship. Okay. It's less focused on performing rituals correctly. Right? So we have this more kind of humanitarian focus in the Deuteronomistic or the Deuteronomic Code. And finally, the observance of this, we could say observance is linked to remembrance. Do you remember when we were looking at the Holiness Code in Leviticus? Why did they say, why were the people of Israel to be holy?
Because Yahweh was holy.
Right. Be holy for I am holy. That's Leviticus. Deuteronomistic Code, observance, it says, be this way because of what God has done for you. This is where the Deuteronomistic Code is coming from, right? Less of an emphasis on holiness. It's not be holy for I am holy. It is live this kind of way because God has done so much for you. Right? This is the justification in the Deuteronomic Code. Okay. So these are kind of the three main codes that we, kind of law codes in the sense that we see in the first 5 books, in the Pentateuch.
So
Right,
three
the
of
Torah.
those covenant codes?
The Covenant Code, the Holiness, and the Deuteronomic. Remember, this is in Exodus. And this is 22 something, I'm not sure. Okay. Now the last thing I want to bring up that's critically important to know test, is what's referred to as the Shema. Who has their Bibles with them today? Somebody can return to Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9. S-H-E-M-A.
4 through 9.
Yep.
Yeah, I got it.
You got it?
Read it out.
Yeah, it'd be great. All right, listen up. This is what gets referred to as the Shema.
Can you give me the verse again?
It's Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9.
All right. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and your gates.
Good. This can be considered kind of the motto of Judaism. Right? If Judaism has a motto, it is the Shema. And it's called the Shema. This is just the Hebrew word for hear. Right? As Bob read, that first word was, "Hear, O Israel." The Lord is God, the Lord is one.
How do you describe it?
This is kind of the motto of Judaism. Yeah. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. And it's with the Shema that we see the clearest kind of verbalizing of monotheism. Right? Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is God, Yahweh is one. Right? This very clear saying, like, we're not henotheistic, we're not polytheistic. The Lord is God, the Lord is one. Right? What we also see with the Shema is this kind of commitment to Moses' teachings. Right? Can I borrow this real quick?
I was gonna ask you, what is the covenant code? What is that you got up there?
The covenant code is from Exodus. It's what follows the Decalogue.
Exodus what?
20 through something. I'm not sure where that ends. Right? It says, let's see, keep these words that I'm commanding you today in your heart. It's important to know that Deuteronomy is pretty much one big speech by Moses. Okay? And in this big speech by Moses, he's pretty much recapping all of Israel's history. Right? And recapping a lot of the laws. So it's this big farewell address that Moses is giving on the edge of the promised land. Right? Numbers has pretty much gotten us right up to the edge of the promised land. And Moses is up there saying one big farewell address before he dies. Right? And Deuteronomy ends with his death. Just lost the page. Okay? So there's this, as Moses is saying this, he's saying, keep all these words. Keep this commitment to the Torah. Keep this commitment to the covenant. Right? In order so that what? So that you don't get vomited out of the land. Right? So that you can be a people set apart. Keep these words that I'm commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you get up and you lie down. Bind them as a sign around your head. Right? Keeping these words. Right? Think back to the command in Genesis to keep the land. Right? There's this is like central to who you are to be as a people. Okay? So the Shema is critically important for Judaism, and kind of is very much the heart of the Torah. Okay? Are there any questions about what we've gone over today? Kind of about the offerings, or these codes, or the Shema?
It's gonna be on the test.
That's a lot to remember.
What is the translation of Shema?
Shema is just here. It's Hebrew for here.
Oh, Hebrew.
Yeah.
I wanna ask you a question.
I think, I'm trying to remember in Hebrew, it's like Shema. I don't remember how to say it's like Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, Lord is God.
I want to ask a question. It don't have nothing to do with the test.
Okay.
Like where it say one of the codes say, don't practice witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
And one, was it Elijah or somebody like that did that little sorcery stuff? Ain't
Yeah.
that the same?
Yeah, you get Saul asking and talking. No, who was it? I'm trying to remember.
Saul, he wanted
Yeah.
to raise somebody up from the dead.
Right. Yeah, no, that happens, and it's really bizarre because it happens, and yet the text doesn't really condemn it in that moment. And this is one of the things where, we kind of like get that glimpse, like with that story, we get this glimpse back into the ancient world where, in a sense, the Hebrew people acknowledge that these things happen and are possible. It's just saying don't do them, right? It's not saying don't do them because they're silly and pointless and don't have any effect. They're saying don't do this because this isn't the kind of way of worship that we've been, called to.
But they were punished.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.